What does manual mode mean, and do I have to learn it? Yes, you do, in brackets. Hi, and welcome to episode 117 of the Photography Explained podcast. I'm your host, Rick, and in each episode, I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 10 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. What I tell you is based on my lifetime of photographic experience and not Google. Before I go on, I need your help. I need your questions to answer. More on this at the end, but please have a think while you listen to this splendid episode. Here is the answery bit. Manual mode is the mode where you set the aperture, shutter speed and ISO when you take a photo. You decide all the camera settings, not the camera. You should learn how to use manual mode as there are times when you will need it, and understanding manual mode helps you learn the exposure triangle. You should learn how to use manual mode, but you do not have to use it all the time. Okay, that was my answer. You should learn how to use manual mode, but you don't have to use it all the time. Unless you want to, that is. Shall I explain? Okay, for this one, I'd like to go back in time to my photography blog, actually, which you can find at rickmcavoyphotography.com. Okay, plug over. Now, I wrote a blog post with the same title as a result of seeing one of the things that I hate the most online. It was someone saying something along the lines of, to be a real photographer, you have to take all your photos in manual mode. One of those ridiculous things. And more on that in the talky bit. But I want to answer the fundamental question first. Manual mode is the mode where you set the aperture, shutter speed and ISO. You can do what the camera meter tells you that you should do, or you can do something completely different. You can use whatever settings you want. The camera will take the photo using the settings that you choose and not what the camera suggests. In manual mode, the exposure is down to you and you alone. What is manual mode? Well, there are many modes on cameras, and I will use my Canon 6D as the basis of this bit. Don't worry, the principles of what I'm telling you apply, even if you have a different camera made by a different camera manufacturer. After all, just hit the mic. I'll tell you what I know based on what I do myself, and not just Google searches, okay? So, on my Canon 6D, you have what are called the basic zone modes, and I'll quote from the Canon 6D manual here, which I do like to do, I have to tell you. With basic zone modes, all you do is point and shoot while the camera sets everything automatically. Open brackets, page 83 and page 342. Yes, page 342. Also, to prevent botched pictures due to mistaken operations, the main shooting function settings cannot be discharged. Botched pictures. Nicely put, Canon. I really like that. Okay, so that's what's called basic shooting. Now, for what Canon calls advanced operations, you use what are called the creative zone modes. The manual says, in creative zone mode, you can set the shutter speed / aperture to set the exposure as desired. By changing the camera settings, you can obtain various results. That's good enough for me. The creative zone modes are P for program, not P for professional, AV, aperture value, aperture priority, TV, time value, shutter priority, B for bulb, and M for manual. So manual mode is called an advanced operation by Canon using one of the creative zone modes. And that bit about the botched pictures and the other settings, you set all the settings in manual mode, everything. And whatever your camera system, in manual mode, you set the aperture, the shutter and the ISO. So whatever camera system you have here, we're talking about the same thing. Manual mode is pretty much manual mode. Okay, that's what manual mode is. You set the aperture, shutter and ISO yourself, and the camera uses those settings to take a photo, regardless of what the camera meter is saying about the settings that you've chosen. So do I have to learn how to use it? Well, when I say I mean you. That's you, not me. I mean you, my dear listener, not me. I learned this a long time ago, so I'm talking to you here. Do you have to learn how to use it? Well, you don't have to, but I strongly recommend that you do, if you want to, that is. Why? Well, because learning properly how to use manual mode will give you an understanding of the exposure triangle, which can only help you with your photography. And once you've learned how to use it, then it's there when you need it. When will I need manual mode, Rick? Well, anytime the camera's struggling to get the correct exposure, anytime that the lighting is tricky, anytime that you want direct control of the exposure and the photo that you take, anytime you want to use specific camera settings, and anytime you just want to use manual mode, okay? The talky bit, should I shoot in manual mode? If you want to, yes. If you don't want to, no. It's that simple. There is still an amount of disinformation and snobbery about manual mode. Yes, people still say that to be a real photographer, I'm using air quotes here if that's what they're called. To be a real photographer, you have to shoot in manual mode. Well, let me tell you this. I do not shoot in manual mode. So according to those people, I am not a real photographer. Whatever, if people want to think that, up to them, I really do not care. But what I do care about is that you understand what manual mode is and when you might want to use it. And more importantly, that you are not intimidated into using it. You have to be comfortable using manual mode. It's a tool to be used, not an entry requirement to being a real photographer. I like that bit. And it's certainly not a barrier. It's not a reason to give up on photography. Now, we need to think about this a little bit. In AV mode, you select the ISO first, and then you set the aperture, and the camera sets the shutter speed to give you the correct exposure. That was the third time of saying that. I've edited out the first two. If you take photos in manual mode and use the camera's suggested metering reading, then how much difference is this from using AV mode, where you select the aperture and the camera selects the shutter speed? It's not a lot, is it really, if you think about it? Some people use manual mode and just follow the camera's suggested settings, but they're real photographers, right? Wrong. You might as well use program mode. All you're doing is doing what the camera tells you to do. It's just taking you longer because you're making the settings yourself rather than the camera doing them for you. So manual mode to AV, or TV actually, is not a huge leap. They are virtually the same, and if you use exposure compensation with AV or TV modes, you're making the same adjustments that you would or could do in manual mode. You're doing pretty much the same thing, just in a different way. Now, I've explained these different camera modes and exposure compensation in previous episodes, so if you don't know what these things are, just check out the episodes page on the Photography Explained podcast website. Manual mode is a tool for us photographers to use, that's all. Manual mode is as valid as AV mode, which is as valid as TV mode. It's not more valid, just another way of getting the exposure that you as the photographer want. It's just another tool to be used when needed or wanted. If you want to use manual mode all the time, then great, I'm happy for you. If you have no interest in learning how to use the exposure triangle, how to fathom out aperture, shutter and ISO, equally fine. If you're happy letting the camera make all these decisions for you, then great, that's up to you. Whatever your preference is though, do please check out that magical thing called your camera manual so you can get the best out of whatever mode you're using, which will help you to get the best photos that you can. And you never know, there might be some clever modes in there that you didn't even know about. And I bet you there are, because when I went through my manual, I found stuff out I didn't know. But if you do want to understand the exposure triangle, if you do want to develop your photography skills, if you're interested in opening up the possibility to take better photos, then do learn how to use manual mode. Now, I say possibilities here deliberately. Using manual mode does not equal better photos. In fact, next episode, I'm going to tell you how to learn to use manual mode by taking lots of rubbish photos. What do? Well, I've learned how to use manual mode. I use AV mode most of the time and use manual mode when I either want to or I need to. Manual mode is a tool that's available for me to use, and that's all it is. And yes, I am a real photographer. And if someone says to me I'm not a real photographer because I do not use manual mode, do you know what? I don't care. I don't give an actual stuff. I'm more than happy with what I know, how I work, how I create my photos. Related episodes. Well, there's lots of episodes about camera modes. Check out the episodes page for the full list. Next episode is Photography Explained podcast episode 118. I just failed on the mental arithmetic then of adding 1 to 117. How do I learn to use manual mode on my camera? Time for some fun stuff. Yes, really, it's time to take lots of photos, a lot of which will be rubbish. But don't worry, you'll learn lots of good stuff here. Get your question answered. Or questions. You're not limited to one question here. This is what my podcast... This is what my podcast is all about, answering your photography questions, not mine. So please get in touch with your question, and not only will I answer your question, but I will give you a shout out on that episode, which is nice. Just head over to photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start. Okay, I'm done. Well, I thought that was going to be an epically long episode by the amount of words I'd written, but it isn't. Thanks for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast. To find out more about my podcast and do stuff to help me, check out the podcast website, which, as I said, is photographyexplainedpodcast.com. This episode was brought to you by rather a lot of coffee and my soundproof emporium. Well, it works for me anyway. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again very much for listening to me and for giving me 10-ish minutes of your valuable time, and I will see you on the next episode. Cheers from me, Rick.